This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
My guest today is not exactly a mystery man, but he's certainly one of the most surprise appointments of this government. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission. Is it a surprise appointment or a predictable one?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's a surprise to you, a very happy event for me. I'm delighted at what happened.
Yes, it's a pleasant surprise, if I may put it like that. You know,
Good.
you're homecoming to this sort of reform team back in India.
I mean, I've known most of the people in the cabinet, and it's fun to be back. I'm really enjoying, looking forward to it actually.
And Dr. Manmohan Singh in particular, you've worked with him, you've learned from him.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, he was responsible for my first coming back to India in 1979 when he was Secretary Economic Affairs, and I came to the Finance Ministry as Economic Advisor at that time.
But tell me exactly how did it happen in 1979?
Well, you know, there was a vacancy in the ministry for the position of Economic Advisor, and Mr. H.M. Patel was then the Finance Minister, and they had visited Washington, Dr. Manmohan Singh then as Secretary. And they had said to me that they're looking for people, and will I apply for this? I did, and the UPSC offered me the appointment, and I was here.
You were a young economic advisor.
Yes, a young economic advisor. That's absolutely true. And I mean, from 1979 to 2001, I remained in the government in different positions. Pretty much went all over the place.
Well, in so many ways, it's a homecoming for you to come back to the government.
Homecoming in the sense of both coming back to the country is nice, and coming back to the government is also nice.
That's why we chose your old college, St. Stephen's College in Delhi, as the venue for this. Because
that is really
this is
nice.
also a bit of homecoming.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's nice to see the college looking in good shape.
Montek, there is a great deal of surprise. You know, this government came with the support of the left. It came into power. There is a CMP, which in some ways look a little bit like it harps on old times. There's a lot of this criticism and suspicion of IMF, World Bank. We will not follow fund bank policies. You, an IMF man, walks in and there's not a whimper. Now, is it because you are not an IMF man, or because it was packaged well enough politically to the other side?
Well, first of all, I mean, I wasn't in my 3 years an IMF man. I mean, I was head of an independent office which was meant to analyze what the IMF is doing. So in many ways, we looked into the criticisms of the IMF's performance, and I wasn't appointed by the management. So I would definitely say that in that sense, I was not an IMF man. You know, on the issue of the CMP, it is a political document. Right. And in that sense, you can read into it tonalities that may point in one direction, others that point in another direction. But I would sincerely say that, you know, if you were interested in whether India is going to continue with economic reforms and move forward, strengthening the human face aspect, and incidentally, the human face aspect is something that Dr. Manmohan Singh had mentioned in the early 1990s. Right. I think the CMP provides a fairly wide room to devise the kind of policies which will achieve the objectives. Now, the objectives are very clear. I mean, after all, the CMP says we need 7 to 8% growth, and quite frankly, as an economist, I think that if the government commits itself to delivering that and takes a practical approach to the kind of policies that will get you 7 to 8%, I think we should experiment as much as possible to fill in the other gaps. And those gaps are large. I mean, I think the issue of education and health, it is true that the system, it's not the reforms, it isn't as if these things were being delivered in the pre-reform period.
Right.
The fact is, this is an area where we didn't get in place the policies, the institutional framework, or even devote the resources needed to get what we need.
If I can put it a little differently, one, it's a fallacy to say that because we were reforming the economy, we focused on corporate profit and we ignored education and health, which were being looked after much better earlier. They were not being looked after much better.
Yeah, that is completely wrong. In fact, if you look at the data, even during the 1990s, expenditure on the social sectors in the central government actually increased.
Right.
But what happened is that in the states, it actually went down.
The states went bankrupt.
It went down because they were bankrupt. They didn't go bankrupt because they spent too much. They went bankrupt because they had a large number of other subsidies which they couldn't afford, other expenditures increasing, not enough effort on taxation, comprehensive fiscal failure if you ask me.
Right.
And therefore it's not the case that the central government did nothing.
Right.
But I think it's not just a resources issue. And one of the things that we are finding out, and all evaluation shows, that we're not getting value for the resources we are spending. And to my mind, that's half the problem. And there are lots of ideas on how we should do that.
So,
and we
so,
should
so the
explore
full
them.
solution actually is to extend reform to these sectors as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Or to reform
Absolutely.
reform the business and industry and capital markets sector, and in these sectors bring more of the government, old-fashioned intervention.
No, in my view, everything that we've seen suggests that in the area, the modern side of the economy, in industry, the process of globalization, opening up the economy to trade, by and large, the economy has responded well to the initiatives of the government. I think that if you've got new sectors where we've shown competitiveness, not just software, but pharma, auto components, the modernization of the automobile industry is the result of a series of measures taken in the early 1990s. And as a result, what you've got is an auto components industry, which is largely homegrown. These are smaller firms now producing world-class auto components. And I think we are at the beginning of what could be a phase where many, many more Indian suppliers will enter what is called the original equipment market in the automobile sector in the world. So those are very major gains, and I think those policies have worked well. Of course, you need to continue some of the financial sector reforms, capital markets, etc. Where we are lacking, and there are some very important gaps. Number one, you can't have your 7 to 8% growth. You can't start trying to catch up with China with the quality of infrastructure we've got. I mean, India's infrastructure is substandard. I mean, let's be clear about it. Until we recognize that, we're going to get nowhere. So this is one big area. Infrastructure is both rural and also aiming at the modern economy. Now, the solutions are quite different.
Jack Immelt said recently that India has the largest gap between the quality of its human resources and its physical infrastructure.
Well, I've been saying this for the last 5 years, but I'm glad that you're listening when Jack Immelt said so, but he's right.
Well, when you speak here, I'm sure people would listen a lot more.
Well, I'm delighted to have that opportunity, and they really must face up to this fact. And I think the answers are also different. Rural infrastructure is not going to come except through public investment. Let's be totally clear about it. Rural infrastructure. On the other hand, and some of the modern infrastructure, like for example the major road networks, we can introduce certain elements of market economy like tolling of roads. But in my view, in India, the overwhelming bulk of the major road networks in India will have to be built in the public sector through the existing mechanisms and so on. But remember, we are talking about 4-laning the Golden Quadrilateral. Go to China and see what they do with roads. I mean, 4-laning. Yeah. If we are aiming at 7 to 8% growth, if India is going to be a major emerging market economy, 4-laning is ground level zero. We ought to be planning now for 6 and 8-laning, not the whole quadrilateral, but the densely trafficked portion of it. Now, this is one class of. Other class of areas, there's a lot of modern infrastructure where we have to bring in private investment. It can't and shouldn't all be done by the public sector. I think what's happened in telecom is a very good example. You introduce private investment, it's led to a huge expansion in telecom connectivity.
And a good regulator.
They're doing very well. A good regulator, and I personally think that in the regulatory, the example is interesting because regulation began with a number of false starts, some hiccups on the way. But I do think that in the last couple of years, the regulatory system has evolved and today gains credibility.
Fixed by one of your fellow Stephanians, Arun Shourie.
Indeed. I mean, in government, it's never clear who should get the credit, but this package as a whole, whoever worked in it, I don't know where Bajol was, maybe he was also in St. Stephen's College. I think they've done a good job. And today, internationally, the Telecom Regulatory Authority carries credibility, basically. Now, we haven't achieved that in many of the other critical sectors. I mean, power is the most obvious. I mean, you're not going to get private investment going into the supply of electricity to rural areas. But India's major cities, I mean, if we take the top 20 cities in India, they, to my mind, should be classically open for running the distribution system through the private sector, subject to sensible regulation. I mean, after all, Calcutta has had private distribution for a long time. Ahmedabad has had, now Delhi has. Bombay has had.
Right.
I think you extend that to the 20 major cities, you will in fact find that, you know, it'll take the burden off the
But
public sector
what is
management.
stopping us from doing that?
Nothing legally, in my view. The main thing is it's a state government decision. It's not something the central government can
No, but
do.
there's also this whole doubt thrown on power reform by the CMP.
No, I don't think so. I don't think the CMP says that the Electricity Act needs to be reviewed.
Right.
I mean, it is always a good idea to review. It doesn't say there's anything wrong with it. It doesn't say it needs to be repealed. It is always possible that there are some aspects of the Electricity Act that need to be looked at and clarified.
And that's your understanding and reading of the correct situation right now. That this basically means fine tuning or ironing out some flaws instead of any basic changes. There is no retreat from reform there.
That would be my reading. Clearly, when we do a review, we should hear every point of view. But let's look at the principles. I think the principles we should establish, the CMP quite categorically says that in infrastructure, we want private-public partnership. The moment that is conceded, we should go for a regulatory system which comes up to international standards as capable of generating private-public partnership.